A life is like a garden, perfect moments can be had, but not preserved except in memory. This poem that he had written years ago, he went back to and chose that for his final tweet. Hi, my name's Bonnie Moss, and I'm in Burlington, North Carolina. I was a fan of the original series when it premiered and remained a fan, became a friend, and am now a historian on the actor Leonard Nimoy. I have some stories to tell and some memories to share on Trek Untold.
Hello and welcome to Trek Untold, the Star Trek podcast that goes beyond the stars. I am your host, Matthew Kaplowitz. This week, we're celebrating the life and times of the late Leonard Nimoy. This week, on March 26, 2024, Mr. Nimoy would have turned 93 years old. But unfortunately, he left us far too soon back in 2015. His on-screen character of Mr. Spock inspired not only sci-fi for decades to come, but also real-life people to become scientists, educators, engineers, and so many others to pursue their dreams. A fan favorite at conventions, Mr. Nimoy had a reputation for being one of the kindest and humblest Star Trek actors on the scene. Joining us today is Bonnie Moss, a lifelong fan of Star Trek and in particular, Mr. Nimoy. A member of the original Trek fandom, Bonnie was able to change her status from fan to friend through years of diligence, building up trust and a rapport with the actor to learn more about him beyond just what we saw on television screens around the country. In honor of his birthday, Bonnie is taking us on a tour of all things Nimoy, Star Trek included, to paint a fuller picture of who Leonard Nimoy really was. And that was an actor, a poet, a photographer, a humanitarian, and really one of the best people to ever walk this green earth or the planet Vulcan. So let's get our own doctorate now in the life of this very special person, or perhaps in this case, a Spocktorate, as Bonnie Moss tells us the full story about the life and death of the legendary Mr. Leonard Nimoy. But before we start our chat with this week's guest, I want to remind you to please follow Trek Untold on social media, including Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. You can find this show on all of those platforms simply by searching for Trek Untold. Make sure you subscribe to this show, whether that's on the audio platform of your choosing or on YouTube, where the video version of this show lives. And speaking of, make sure to check out our YouTube channel more frequently for episodes of our new mini show, Tales from Trek Untold, as well as other sci-fi goodies. And of course, don't forget to leave ratings, reviews, comments, and whatever you can do no matter what platform you're on to enjoy this podcast and show others that you're digging it too. If you want to support this show financially, please consider becoming a Patreon member at patreon.com/trekuntold. Shout out to Trek Long Island, who is having their second annual convention this summer at Hop Hog, Long Island, New York, from May 31st to June 2nd. Headlined by Melissa Navia from Strange New Worlds, Armin Shimmerman, Chase Masterson, and J.G. Hertzler from DS9, Ethan Phillips from Star Trek Voyager, and Gabrielle Ruiz from Lower Decks. Among many other modern and classic Trek shows, this 3-day event will feature autographs, panels, including some with yours truly, and other ways for you to hang out with the stars and meet your fellow fans. You can learn more about this event or buy tickets for it at treklongisland.com. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead and beam in this week's guest. Computer, access interview file. And joining me now on the other side of the screen, I'm privileged to be chatting today with a Star Trek historian, although I think we can call this person one step beyond that because they're more of a Spockumentarian, I'd say. We're joined today, all the way from North Carolina, by Bonnie Moss. Bonnie, how are you today?
I'm great, Matthew. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
We got to meet a little while ago back at the first Trek Long Island event, and we kept missing each other. But I'm happy we finally made it work almost a year later. We got it done, Bonnie.
That's right. Better late than never.
Exactly.
And I enjoyed that convention. That was a nice convention. So it was nice to meet you and a lot of other people who had been names to me, but not faces. So that was great.
Yeah, for me, that was actually my second ever Star Trek convention. I know for you, you've probably done like tons of them. For me, that was number two.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow. Well,
so
you blended in perfectly.
thank you, thank you. I try to fit in. So
Uh,
yeah, today we're gonna be talking about one very important member of the Star Trek universe. That would be Mr. Leonard Nimoy. And March 26th is his birthday. He would have been, I believe, 93 or 94.
93. He and
Wow.
William Shatner are the same age. So so they're 4 days apart, their
Really?
birthdays,
No.
same year. So whenever, so William Shatner's 92, he'll be 93 in March. Leonard would have been 93 in March. So,
Wow. So
mhm.
yeah, I mean, we're going to be digging in today to a lot of the history of Leonard Nimoy beyond just Star Trek, because there's a lot to this man. You were privileged enough to be able to spend a lot of time with him through the years. But before we get into Mr. Nimoy, I want to get a little bit of background information about you and about your love of Star Trek. So, can you tell us, Bonnie, where you grew up, who your parents
Mhm.
were, and what they did, and what did little Bonnie want to be when she grew up?
Oh my. Okay. This is one of those questions you told me that might be ones I'm not anticipating. And
Yep,
that's one of
exactly.
them. I was actually born in Virginia, but was raised in Burlington, North Carolina. My father worked for what was then the Western Electric Company. He was a senior engineer, which begat AT&T, which begat Lucent Technologies. So he started with what was known as Western Electric, and retired with AT&T. And he was an engineer with defense missile systems. So worked a lot with Hercules and Titan and Safeguard missile systems that were defensive, for the government. After he retired, I just add this, he wanted to keep working, and so he went to work for GE in engineering and was worked on one of the components for Space Mountain at Disney World. So he said he felt a lot better working on something that made people happy rather than something that could be potentially destructive. And my mom worked in the insurance industry. Thank you. They're both gone now, but excellent parents, and indulged my love for all things science fiction and Star Trek. So I lived in other towns in North Carolina: Greensboro, North Carolina; Fayetteville, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, but came back to Burlington maybe 20 years ago. So that's kind of the background I came from. So my dad was more into the science stuff. I wouldn't call either of my parents science fiction aficionados. My mother watched documentaries. My dad was very much into sports. They didn't watch a lot of programmatic TV. It was, just not a priority for them. And I think they saw 5 movies that I can think of, my entire lifetime. So they were not media. I didn't. The affection for TV and film came. I came by that on my own.
So, did you see yourself as a little girl growing up to be like an insurance agent or a scientist, or what did you want to be?
I couldn't decide between a nurse or a teacher, so I did a compromise and became a clinical social worker.
Hmm.
And I don't know whether Edith Keeler was back there somewhere, and came to the fore, but I was a licensed clinical social worker, and I worked 20. So again, growing up, to answer your question, it was nurse or teacher, and what I became was a fusion. I think I worked in the mental health field for 20 years and worked in the hospice field for 20 years, and I'm happy to be retired. Those are two tough populations. Two tough populations. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very admirable career to be in. Hospice care is tough, so very, very much grateful for the work that you've done.
Thank you. Thank you. You don't get rich, but as they want us to say, but the richness of experience and knowing you've made a real impact on someone's life. You don't have too many jobs where you can see it, feel it, experience it.
Well, it takes a special kind of person to do that, Bonnie. So, really hats off to you for that.
Thank
Uh,
you.
so, I'd like to kind of find out now how Star Trek eventually fits into this here. But, like, growing up, were you into like science fiction? Were you a fan of things like Lost in Space, or how far, without going into any details of whatever, but how far back does your love of sci-fi go?
Well, I was a child of the '60s. I was born in the '50s. How's that for vague, but placing
I
it?
didn't want to go there. That's what I was trying to avoid.
No, no, you're being very tactful. Much appreciated. No, I mean, you get to a certain age where whatever, you know. Just saying you were there when the original series premiered automatically dates you to a certain age group. But I never even. I'm trying to get an age range. Maybe 12 when Star Trek premiered, 11, 12. And so before that time, 10, 11, 12, I actually enjoyed Outer Limits and Twilight Zone more than the Lost in Space. And I was a voracious reader, not now, but so even I was like, I respect Lost in Space, but I could see that this wasn't really high tech stuff, you know. Whereas Outer Limits and Twilight Zone for their day, their special effects and their stories and everything were much more compelling, you know. No diss to the Lost in Space people, okay? But that was just my personal. So I was already into those programs. I love the Wild Wild West. I love The Man from Uncle. So I was very much, and you know, Wild Wild West was Western slash sci-fi, you know, you know, if you really look
Best of
at it,
both
you know,
worlds.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So I was very much into those shows, and I did do some science fiction reading, but on the level of, you know, 11, 12-year old, you know, stuff, you know, some mostly magazine science fiction stories. And again, on television, I kind of leaned toward the esoteric rather than, um, you know, the more pedestrian stuff that was on TV at that time, you know. And it was a great time to be, you know, I mean, my Star Trek years in those years were like, you know, 12 to 16, you know, or 12 to 15. That that's a big change in your life going from that, you know, that just that age back then, you know, you're going from a pre-adolescent to a mid-adolescent, you know. So you experience these shows on one level as a child or as a young person, and then you experience them again on another level as you're older, and then another level as you're an adult and you look back at them. You get different things from them in different ages.
It is kind of fascinating that Star Trek walked into your life when you were at a very important age. I mean, you're at an age where basically you're changing. You're starting to become an adult, but you're not quite there yet. Starting to go through the physical, the mental, the hormonal changes. And here is Star Trek almost like to guide you along in some ways, right?
Yeah, yes. It was the timing was wonderful. And I was watching that first night because I was like, you know, this sounds better than what I've seen before, you know, just in the promos. It was intriguing. And it popped up. People have to remember color TV was still a novelty at this point, you know, and I was watching my other shows go into color. Wild Wild West was black and white, went into color. You know, Man from Uncle was in black and white. You know, others, Beverly Hillbillies were going from black and white into color. Gilligan's Island, black and white into color. So I was in that age group where you just saw a whole new dimension to shows that were already on the air through that transition to color. And then Star Trek premiered with those, it popped. It was the first thing I saw on TV that literally popped through the screen
Mm.
in terms of those primary colors, in terms of the, you know, how it was lit, in terms of, it was eye candy. You know, the other stuff was, you know, the cherry on the cupcake, you know. But for a kid, this was like, this looks great. You know, here's the reds and the yellows and the blues and the way those hallways were lit and everything. And so it was no surprise when several color TV promoters, I think Philco and there are a few others, used Star Trek on the screen promoting their color TVs. You know, what does that say? They recognize that too.
So, what was it about Star Trek that kept you coming back for more? And what made you sort of, start to become this massive fan of the franchise before it really even was a franchise?
Right, right. The visual thing was first. The fact that I was drawn to science fiction, you know, played into that. I liked the characters. I thought the characters were three-dimensional, you know, and even the aliens were three-dimensional. You know, in so many shows, you had the aliens but you didn't know what they were really about, other than destroying or, um, so this was new to have characters that were more fully developed, and when they encountered the unknown, um, it wasn't immediately deemed to be dangerous, hurtful, nor were the aliens always trying to hurt them. They were misunderstood, perhaps, So you get all that layering in there. And then, I was in North Carolina in the mid 60s. Okay. So there wasn't a lot of diversity. That has changed with how North Carolina has grown industrially and banking and so forth. Um, didn't see many Asians, didn't see many Russians, didn't see many, you know, um, um, uh, other other nationalities. So that was a great exposure. And I remember when we would play Star Trek. Now this is on the end of being the 10ish. We would play Star Trek, go on swing sets, and that was the Enterprise, and we would play. Everyone wanted to be Sulu. They didn't want to be Captain Kirk. They didn't want to be Mr. They wanted to be Sulu because he was different. He had a cool name. It was fun to say. And so here was that diversity, and it was, I was fortunate to be in an environment where it was embraced. And so the novelty of seeing that diversity was there. And I, you put it all together and you have something you can't wait to see the next week, because literally you did not know what to expect. It wasn't, oh, here we're going to have the alien of the week. Well, that might be an episode where there's not even an alien. Kirk's going to be replaced by a computer. I mean, it wasn't predictable. It wasn't predictable. And so I think all of that came together. And lastly, again, being in the mid 60s like that, what we were seeing on our TV every night was the assassination of Robert Kennedy. I was in elementary school when John Kennedy was assassinated. I remember when they sent us all home. Um, and of course, in the mid 60s, Bobby Kennedy, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., all of this was on our TV screens every night. And there were only 3 channels then. Hello, maybe 4 if you counted PBS. So that was all on every channel, every screen. There was no escaping it. So as a child, you're wondering, and you're seeing Memphis going up in flames in the riots, post Dr. King, and you're trying to make sense of it all. You're just trying to make sense of it. And the Vietnam War was raging, and every night Walter Cronkite. This always perplexed me. He would close the newscast with a Vietnamese flag and a United States flag, with the casualties of the day, or at least the casualties as were reported for the day. And the Vietnamese would have lost, you know, 200, 222, and the US had lost 5. And I'm thinking, how then are we losing? I mean, what's going on here? Why is this raging on if the numbers are like that daily? So even as a child, I was like, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense. And there was Star Trek to say, someday it will. Someday we'll be beyond all of that. Money will not be, a primary motivator. We'll all get along. We'll look back on these days as when we were savages. So that inherent optimism that Star Trek had was the other pull, because that helped me make sense of what was really going on. Okay, this is what we got to go through to get to that.
So it was Star Trek that kind of changed your view of the world in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. 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 The optimism and wanting to help others. Yeah.
And it seems like that definitely informed some of your choices later on in life.
Right. Absolutely. I ended up and again, this is as an adult, when I would look back and like see City on the Edge of Forever, and they said, that, let me help, will be, as important as any other thing we could say. And I'm like, wow, that's kind of was my mind's, before I didn't notice that the first time it was broadcast. It was of course establishing, Keeler's character and everything. But the let me help part. That was from that episode, was it not?
I'm going to take your word for it because I think you know that better than I do.
Yeah, well, I'm sure there'll be people who will certainly correct that. But it was in one of the episodes where that was deemed just as important, so it got. But the social worker part with Edith Keeler, I think definitely not at the time, but subliminally, probably assisted that.
So, is it safe to say that Spock was your favorite character?
Yes, and I'm certainly not alone in that. I mean, I went from enjoying Star Trek and all the things I said previously to enjoying and trying to figure out the Mr. Spock character and realizing the layers of depth there. He was very emotional. He just didn't display said emotions, except under duress or under some kind of, so they had to be there or they'd never be exposed. But they were exposed on many an occasion, so you knew they were there. And I think that was so masterful of Leonard Nimoy to be stoic. And that's why a lot of actors didn't want that role. Well, I'm just going to be unresponsive. What actor wants to do that? They want to emote. They want to play with their voices and their faces and whatnot. And Leonard was able to convey that stoicism, and yet you're not bored with it. You understand there's something more there. And I think even then I was like, he's showing he's not feeling, but I can tell he's feeling this. And there you go. That's why you get 3 Emmy nominations, folks. At least other actors recognized this was quite the skill, to convey or not convey, different layers of who Spock was. So he very quickly became the most intriguing. And of course, the qualities that everyone's familiar with, the loyalty, the intelligence, um, the very dry sense of humor, all of that came with it. So I started buying movie magazines. Now, of course, as a kid, I'm begging my mom for the 25 cent. That's what movie magazines cost back then. TV Picture Life, Modern Screen, Photo Play. And so in the grocery store, I'm mom, I want a new movie, here, go away, here's your quarter. And I would stand at the stand to see which ones had the articles on Leonard Nimoy because I was interested in Spock. So I started collecting movie magazines with Leonard Nimoy in them. And what I read about him, and of course, movie magazines, there's some rose-colored glasses there, and they always have an angle, but there's also some basic truths, in the article, even though it may be flowered up a bit. And so what I read about him in terms of, interviews where he seemed to be intelligent in real life, that just didn't seem to be limited to the character. He seemed to have a conscience. I was aware of some of his political activities through some of the more mainstream magazines. He marched in protest for the migrant workers in California with Cesar Chavez. I mean, it was um, he was politically very active, and so I started liking the person, and he was interested in music, and you could tell then there was more to him than just playing the Spock role. So that went from Star Trek to Mr. Spock to liking the man who played Spock.
And before we start going down our real deep dive into Mr. Nimoy, I want to kind of go back to your personal fandom a little bit here, because I want to talk about the cancellation of Star Trek, and I'm curious, if you were ingrained into the fandom yet. We know famously the Trimbles are part of that campaign of letter writing to help get Star Trek just at least some notoriety again, and
Right.
I'm curious, if you were involved in any letter writing stuff as well, or what was it like
I,
for you? 'Cause, here comes this show that's life changing for you, and now 3 seasons later, it's gone.
right. Right. I remember the frustration at the move kept that they kept moving the times. They kept, and I think at least one year they were up against Laugh In. Well, I loved Laugh In. And I was like, "Why put my two favorite shows, against each other?" I remember being frustrated by that and just trying to find it because, I don't think we received a TV guide. You got your
Mm.
TV thing in the newspaper, and if somebody didn't keep Sunday's paper, well, you're just gonna have to flip among those 3 channels and or those times, 8 o'clock, you gotta check, 9 o'clock, you gotta check, because they would move it. So I remember those things more than the actual, cancellation. Again, there was no social media back then. There was no real way for a bunch of fans throughout the country to communicate. You could have enclaves in California and New York who could protest at NBC, but they were in the area. If, those of us elsewhere could not get to those places. And what would be the means of communicating? You didn't have a way to communicate with other fans. You only knew the fans in your area. And long distance calls were very expensive and prohibitive. Your parents weren't going to let you get on the phone and talk for an hour to someone in New Jersey. That wasn't going to happen. So I think the cancellation, um, I wasn't on the front end in terms of the letter writing and whatnot, because of where I was, because of the information I had, because of the age I was. Back then you had to ask your parents for a stamp. I mean, they were in a little box. You just didn't, go get a roll of stamps and to anything. The short answer is no, but it was due to all of those factors, not having the communication that it had been canceled until you see it in the TV schedules, or you see it in an article, or I probably saw it in a movie magazine because Leonard had transitioned to Mission Impossible, and so there was all this early promo stuff on Mission Impossible. So, and had I been older, I think I would have been more aggressive in finding things out. Whatever you found out was going on in fandom was usually by virtue of being a member of a fan club, you know, um, and like some of the Star Trek clubs back then, the Star Trek Well Committee. The I was a member of the Leonard Nimoy Association of Fans, so you would communicate that way. But that's by mail, you know. You're not calling each other. It's chain letters. It's here's the latest, and you put it in an envelope, and then that person mails it to the next person to the next person. You got to remember telephone, computers, media, you had to make your own, discern things in any way you could.
It's kind of interesting just hearing how, the way fandom was back when Star Trek's first around to how it is now. And I kind of wonder if, and this is just, kind of a big picture sort of question unrelated to what we're talking about today, but, I wonder if the speed of how information has been processed has also affected the general optimism or cynicism of fandoms in sci-fi. Do you have any thoughts on just how technology has maybe changed things and sometimes maybe not for the better in this regard?
Well, that's a good question. That's a very good question. I do think it's hard when someone can put what you think is a pretty innocent statement or a heartfelt statement out there, and there's immediately, almost instantaneously, either on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, whatever you may be on, a negative response. And I'm like, you had a problem. I'm thinking you had a problem with that. It was like you put out this. This is an extreme example. The sky's blue today. Well, it's not blue here. Well, it's really not as blue as it used to be. Well, why would you, choose blue over the marvelous sunsets we have? And I'm just like, are you kidding me? Can we just not go with the sky is blue? So people are more oppositional, and they're more oppositional very quickly. you know Whereas back then you were just so hungry for information,
Mm,
and appreciated what people shared. I don't think we thought to be negative about it. We might say, well, no, Kirk's not my favorite character, he's such and such. Well, yeah, but he still looks good in that. You didn't It didn't become oppositional.
yeah.
You had opinions without having to fight for them. So I do think social media allows, more trolling and more people who really aren't invested but just want to stir the pot. or who are misinformed and weigh in, and their misinformation is obvious. So I do think it has an impact because the feedback is sometimes just misinformed or just meant to draw attention to themselves or what, as opposed to it being sought after, appreciated information, that you want to share with the next person. So sadly, yes, I do think. Um, I mean, obviously, we know the obvious advantages of being, not having to worry about long distance phone calls, not, not having to worry about getting a stamp and writing to find out, what's going on. Information is easily accessible, but I do think, um, yes, it's a shame that people cannot hold opinions without being vilified in some cases. That's unfortunate. I was a bit more involved, not to any great scale, in the clamor to make Star Trek into a movie. I do remember writing because I was older then, and in high school and in college, and so I do remember letter writing campaigns to, um, I guess it was Paramount at the time, that saying we want a Star Trek movie and there's an audience for it. And I do remember joining some clubs. I have boxes of stuff. I mean, it's um, not a hoarder, but I've kept a lot of those early things where they encourage you to write, and so I do think I was among the many, many, many who pushed for that Star Trek movie and wrote regularly to make that happen.
Well, let's kind of talk about now how Bonnie Moss went from Leonard Nimoy fan to Leonard Nimoy's friend. Do you remember the first time that you ever met Mr. Nimoy?
I do. And of course this didn't happen overnight. This happened over many, many years. And on the backside of Star Trek, Star Trek had already been, done. I knew Leonard by being virtue of a member of his fan club. We did get regular newsletters and yearbooks. Louise Stange, who is still with us, was the president. Not the first president, but the one that had stayed the president the longest. And she did a very good job at getting information out to us about Leonard. He did a lot of theater, more theater than people realize. And he also did a lot of college lecture tours, I mean, all over the country. So in the 70s, by virtue of, these postcards you might get, Leonard's going to be in your area, still all through fan clubs. This was still pre, social media. So the first time I saw him was actually in 1976. He came to the University of North Carolina at Greensboro for a lecture, and I and several friends went. And again, just like I kind of liked what he was like in the magazines, I was like, well, let's see what he's like in person. I don't, but still, hoping no illusions would be shattered. And of course, he came out and he was handsome and he was funny and he was intelligent and he handled the crowd well and he was sincere in his appreciation. And so, okay, I was like, okay, this is a win. He's really personable and did not meet him on that occasion. Got another notice. So that was furthering the process that he was going to appear in a stage play that he adapted, directed, um, and starred in a one-man show called Vincent. And it was regarding Vincent van Gogh. And he is actually playing Vincent's brother, Theo or Teo Van Gogh, who is eulogizing his brother at his funeral. And it's a one-man show. Leonard comes out, acknowledges that his brother has died, and then you kind of get through him the life of Vincent Van Gogh. And back behind him are projections of Vincent's work that change throughout the show. So you get this really immersed in Van Gogh's work, and it's always amazed me how actors can memorize volumes of lines, and this was a show. So he was going to do this in Washington D.C. And of course, if you're in the deep South, Washington and Atlanta is pretty much all you could hope for back then in terms of major, stage productions. So I decided to go up to Washington with a friend to see him in this play. And of course, we were both enamored, and we said, well, let's buy 3 tickets, let's go see 3 shows. And so we did. We went up to Washington, D.C., and we went into the theater um, to pick up our tickets. I guess um, what do they call that? On call or something like that.
Will call.
Yes, thank you. And so we went in to get our tickets, and the lady handed it's just the box office at this theater, and it was near on the campus of Catholic University in Washington, D.C. And I jokingly said, "Is Mr. Nimoy here?" And she said, "Well, he comes and goes. I know we had a rehearsal this afternoon and blah, blah, blah." And I said, "Okay." And I said, "Well, can we peek into to see the stage?" I mean, it was mezzanine and then some double doors into. And she said, "Oh, sure, you can take up, you know." And so I opened the door, and he was literally coming up the walkway. And I was like, "Oh God," I really hadn't, really was just wanted to see the stage. And he was coming up, and of course my friend Olive and I, we started backing up because we were actually in his way. And of course he stopped. And I was like, I just was gonna look at, and he was kind of chuckling. He knew he had caught us unawares. Well, of course I had a huge tote with all of our stuff in it, and I had one of his poetry books in there that had just come out. So I brought it out and I said, "Do you mind?" He said, "Oh no, not at all, not at all." And it was just us, in the lobby, and the ticket lady behind the booth. And so he signed it, and I always remember this. And this was meant as not flirtatious, but it was just funny. While he was signing, I said, "Are you going to bring Vincent further south?" And he kind of looked down and looked up, and he went, "How far south do you want me?" And and I said, "Well, North Carolina would be good." And he said something like, "Oh, I could tell you were, from the South," or something like that. But it was very disarming. "How far south do you want me?" in that voice. And he did bring Vincent to Atlanta the next year, so I take full responsibility for bringing that to the South.
As you
And
should.
and he handed me and he said, "So you're going to be seeing the show this evening?" We said yes. I mean, he was interested. He was interested. It wasn't like go. I mean, albeit there weren't 20 million people in there. And we finally, I said, "Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing the show. Thank you. Thank you for coming." And he went on out. And the lady behind the ticket booth was going, and she was like, "I knew he was in there, but I couldn't tell you. And she was thrilled that we got to see him, which I thought was very sweet. So before the show that evening, we decided to find out where the stage door was because we wanted to greet him afterwards and maybe get another autograph on our Leonard Nimoy Association of Fans yearbook. So we went around to the back and we're like, "Oh, and there were like 2 or 3 other people there, 2 or 3 other ladies. Um, I mean, people are very naive if they don't realize Leonard had a huge female contingency. um, I mean, the guys liked him for his scientific mind. The women liked him for a lot more. So anyway, there were like 2 or 3 other ladies there, and so we started talking, and we were just ignoring the stage door because we had found it. Now we were talking about the show that evening, and it had started to rain, and we're like, "Oh gosh, you think they'll let us in the lobby? Do we want to go back to our?" We had flown up there, so we didn't have anywhere to go. Maybe we can go in an academic building until the rain stops. Blah blah blah. Well, the stage door opens, and we thought we were going to be shooed away. And we're like, "We're just out here, as the doors open. We're going. We just want to find." It was Leonard who opened the stage door, and he goes, "What's going on?" And we said, "Well, we wanted to find the stage door, but to see you this evening." And he started laughing. I mean, he was just him, and we don't know why. We think later maybe he was going out the stage door to have a cigarette. But he opened the stage, and he said, "Well, it's raining." We said, "Yeah, we're going to look for a place to go until the show." And he went, "You're going to get wet going anywhere. Come on back." So we were invited backstage to the show, and he stopped in the hallway, the scaffolding and everything was everywhere. And he said, "Well, where are you from?" And he looked at me and all of me. He said, I saw you guys this afternoon." And we were like, "Yeah, we're still from North Carolina." And the other people said where they were from. He always, this was consistent. If he was in a small crowd or a small group of people and met you, he wanted to know where you were from. He wanted to know what you did. He wanted to know how far you came to see the show. And then he would be incredulous that you came more than 10 miles to see it. I mean, I'm serious. When he was like, "From North Carolina?" I mean, there was a modesty about him that he was touched when people came distances or made sacrifices to see him. And so he wanted to know as much about us as we him. And of course, I had my infamous tote, and Invasion of the Body Snatchers had just come out. And again, no social media, no, anything like that. I had had written the studios. And see, this is how I started my collection. We may touch on that later, but I have an enormous collection. I wrote the fan magazines. I wrote the studios. I wrote the theater. I wrote anything and everything. And as you know, back then, people they'd just send me stuff. They didn't care. It wasn't all these copyrights and for they were going to throw it away. They just threw publicity stuff away. Magazines threw the photo shoots away. The proofs and everything. So they're like, okay, this kid wants it. Well, I had a still from Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Oh, wow.
And I brought that out, and it was of him as Dr. Kibner. And I took it out, and he held it in his hands, and he held it in his hands. He said, "I have not seen this." And he said, "How did you get it?" And I said, "Right at the studio." He went, "Really?" You know, and he was fascinating that this kid from North Carolina had a publicity still he hadn't even seen. I learned at that point when he held on something onto something that long, he wanted it. I didn't catch on to that back then. I learned later on and benefited from saying, "You want that?" "Yeah." And he'd hand it to somebody or put it in a briefcase he was carrying. So, I think the fact that the first two things I had him sign, poetry book, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. It wasn't a spot photo. There was he recognized there were people out there who were aware of other things that he did. So that was the start of it. And then I won't go into detail, but the other two shows, again, he greeted us afterwards at the stage door, came over, gave me a big hug, and he said, "How many times are you seeing this?" He had a mind like a steel trap back then, because he recognized, the return customers, so to speak,
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how it started. And then in 1980, I went to see Vincent in Atlanta, was taken backstage again there because I had written the theater. You just had to, that was what passed for LinkedIn, those days. You wrote, the manager, said, "Oh, yes, Leonard would be happy to see you." I was working on an inpatient psychiatric unit at that time. And I had a patient who was a huge Leonard Nimoy fan. She was 13. In my opinion, she did not need to be on a psychiatric unit. This was psychiatry in the, you know, 30, 40 years ago. Not that it's improved
In Star Trek
tremendously, but
terms, the Dark Ages.
yes, yes. I mean, this was a locked ward that had 45-year-old male alcoholics and 13-year-old adolescent girls on it, all on the same floor, you know. And they didn't separate the substance abuse from the schizophrenics. It was a mishmash, And I remember there just being a haze because everyone smoked, and there wasn't any smoking, restrictions back then. Yeah, I've seen some things. So anyway, when she heard that I was going to Atlanta to see Leonard Nimoy, she was like, "Please, please, 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 can you get me?" I said, "I can't promise anything, but." So I wrote the theater, indicated that I had seen Vincent before, but was coming down, wanted to get an autograph for this young patient. And when we got there to the theater, it was the Peachtree Playhouse, which I learned later Leonard had played there back in the day when he was stationed there in the Army. He was stationed in Atlanta, and his daughter Julie was born in Atlanta. This was the theater he had played in way back when, so it was kind of a homecoming for him. But the manager was, I'm trying to make a long story short, but the manager was in the lobby again when we came to pick up the tickets, and he kind of, because I'd sent him a photograph of Leonard and I in Washington. He said, "You're the young lady who wrote." And I said, "Yes." He said, "Leonard says it's fun. Come to the stage door, wait till the crowd dissipates. You're in, to go backstage." So that's kind of how. But another thing about Leonard that impressed me in that was I came back and her first name was Sarah. And I'd only seen the medical record, which was the last name, first initial. And of course, I had called her Sarah. I said, first and foremost, I want to get this autograph for my patient. And he said, "That's wonderful. What kind of unit is it?" Questions, questions, questions. And then he said, "Does she spell it with an H or not?" And I was like, wow, I didn't know if she spelled it with an H or not. I mean, it was a lesson in, for me, you know, don't say the last name, first initial, or just call someone's name. He wanted it to be right,
Mm.
and I felt very humbled by that experience. I was like, wow, you cared about that more than I have, in terms of how her name was spelled. And so I had to make a guess, and it was wrong. Um, but he signed it, and he, once again, we got to have a conversation. I gave him a gift. Won't get into all of that. The manager told me later, because I went to see several shows while there. Manager of the Peachtree Playhouse told me later, "Leonard hung your gift in his dressing room." I said, "You got to be kidding me." He said, "No." He said he was really touched by it. So many of these experiences, trying to make a long story short. Um, and then it transitioned to being active in the fan club. I think he saw my name in a lot of their publications and some of the photos I had contributed. I think the next, huge shift, there were little things, was in 2009, perhaps. And it was at a convention in Boston. It was a Boston Fan Expo, and Leonard was there. Um, and in that convention was very pivotal because both Leonard's parents and his first wife, Sandy, had written me several times, usually as a result of having sent them something or and Sandy would always write back and say, "Leonard and I had never seen these pictures. And where did I get the pictures? From writing other places, saying, "Send me stuff." Then I would pass them on. It was a it was a chain letter, except it was to the Nimoys, this one. So she always wrote back. His parents were lovely people, never met them, but they would write me. And they didn't care about who knew their address. They put Nimoy in their address in a suburb of Boston. They were still living outside Boston at this time. So at this convention, I had decided that I wanted to give Leonard one of those letters from his parents because they said some things I felt he wanted to hear. He had a kind of a, he never felt he could please them 100%. They didn't understand what he did. They appreciated it. They certainly understood it was popular and he was a success, but the nuances weren't always there. So during that convention, I gave Leonard that letter. That meant a great deal to him. He was almost tearful when I did do it. The minute I brought it out, he said, "That's my mother's handwriting." I said, "Yes." And he said, "Oh, wow." And I said, "I want you to have it." And he said, "Really?" I said, "I want you to have it. I think you need to read it." And boy, that cemented things. That really cemented things. And that was another one of the conventions where he called me up on stage, which he didn't do that to too many fans. "Oh, come up on stage," because I was wearing a shirt with his photography on, picture of, and so he came up and used me as a model to talk about his photography and everything. So there were, you know, and the same convention, I was kind of teasing him, the other people in the audience were somewhat amused by it because we were talking about Southern accents. He was talking about his fondness for DeForest Kelley, and I said something like, "Well, yes," and then he said, "Was he from North Carolina?" I said, "No, he was from Georgia." And he knew better, he's just yanking my chain. And then I said, "Do you know DeForest Kelley was the only person in the cast that didn't have an accent?" And he thought about it for a second, and then he went, "Whoa, that's real clever." And I was thinking, "Oh boy, Leonard Nimoy has said that I have said something clever," but it clicked in him. I was from the South, DeForest Keller's from the South. Therefore, to me, he was the only one who didn't have an accent. All the rest of you, had an accent. And once he processed it, he really laughed about that for several minutes. And I said, "You got to remember that Southern accent isn't a Southern accent if you're in the South. It's just how people talk." So that convention was pivotal. I earned a lot of trust from him there. And I also met one of his business acquaintances by the name of Gary Hasson. Gary Hasson was and may perhaps still is the owner of Lightspeed Fine Art, who sells a lot of artwork, prints, and whatnot that are Star Trek, Star Wars related. They were based in California. I think they're based in Florida now. But anyway, Gary Hasson now primarily functions as an agent, a booking person. He'll accompany stars to conventions, kind of their right hand person. But I think he's kind of semi-retired now. But anyway, he was with Leonard at this convention and had a table for Lightspeed Fine Art. And I was at his table after all of this, and he said, "You're the woman Leonard asked to go on stage." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "He enjoyed you. He enjoyed you like that." And I said, he said, you coming on stage and someone gave him a letter from his parents was the highlight of his coming to Boston for this convention." And I went, "I gave him the letter from his parents." And he leaned forward and he said, "Are you kidding me?" And I went, "No." And he went, "Those were the two things Leonard said he remembered most about this convention." And I was just like, "Wow." And then he said, Leonard's into his photography now, and he's gonna have an exhibition up at the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art next year." And I said, "Yes, I'd heard about that." Now that by this time, that may have been on a computer site. And I said, and Leonard mentioned it in his talk at this convention that he was having this exhibition. I said, "Yes, I would love to see that, but I'm sure it's, nosebleed stuff and everything." And Gary said, "I'll see to it you get a ticket. I'll see to it you get in." And I said, "Wow, okay." As it turned out, and so Gary and I stayed in touch for a long time. And Gary would, to his great good credit, said, "Leonard likes you, he trusts you." He would let me know, "There's a convention coming up in such and such. Leonard's scheduled, but he's not going to be able to come. There's a conflict. Just wanted to give you a heads up before you booked it." And I was like, "This is great," and he worked closely with Leonard, mostly business types of things, but he certainly knew Leonard's. But again, and I know this is probably way too much information for most people, but don't want people to think this happened overnight or this happened due to one event. It was a sequence of events. And that next year he did have that exhibition in Boston. As it turned out, it was open to the public. However, I c- it's all about networking, Matthew. You know this. That's how you get your guests. But I contacted the museum and I said, "I'm hoping to come up. I'm a big fan of Leonard's, and is there going to be a reception that I could possibly see him? Is there going to be this? Here's a few pictures of Leonard and I over the years." Damned if they didn't email me and say, "We would love for you to come. We want you." And there are some sponsorship opportunities, and one of them is for Leonard to take your portrait. as your secret self, because the exhibition was called Secret Selves. But you can, definitely you will make sure you see Leonard was the first part, whether you sponsor anything or not. And I said, no, I think I'd really like to have my portrait taken by Leonard Nimoy. That would be kind of cool. So I, went into the piggy bank and said, and worth every penny for the amount of time I had with Leonard that entire weekend. I mean, my God, you'd pay 3 times that through creation or something else to have a tenth of that experience. So, and I was helping the museum. I was sponsoring the exhibition. So I ended up being his primary sponsor for the Secret Sales exhibition at Masmoka. And so as such, we had a lovely morning, of him taking my portrait as my secret self. We had time at the reception. We got to have more and more conversations. I met Susan for the first time. We hit it off quite well. I was at the dinner the night before, where Leonard's other members of Leonard's family were there, Julie and Adam and the grandkids and all. And this was a small dinner at a restaurant at the museums. It accumulated. It just accumulated. And so from there, and Leonard was lovely at the dinner, and he and Susan was seated at different tables, and I was at a different table too. I went over, they took me over to his table because I arrived late because my flight was delayed, of course. And he stood up, greeted me very warmly, and he said, "I appreciate your coming. I appreciate your support of the photography." He says, "I make no money off of this. I make none. My photography I invest in rather than see as because I'm so." And we started talking very briefly, and he mentioned in the course of this conversation, he says, "You remember that letter you gave me from my parents?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." Think of the number of fan interactions he has. Um, he said, "I keep that on my desk. I keep that on my desk." And I thought, wow, what I thought was the case, that this would mean a lot to him, but by a few things his parents said really did mean a lot to him. And so that overwhelmed me. And shortly thereafter, I said, "Well, we need to both go eat." He's like, "Yeah. And then he turned to the museum person and said, "Make sure she meets Susan." Because his wife, because she was at another table. So he wanted, just very thoughtful and very, even as I'm rattling on, I could go on about a half dozen more, but the bottom line is it came from just seeing him in situations where I had the opportunity to convey something personal, you know, and I wasn't dressed as a tribble, and I was fairly articulate, and I was not a stalker, and then Gary vouching for me, and later on his gallerist, Rich Michelson, to whom he was very close, could vouch for me, and he felt very comfortable, and it just went from there.
And we should add, while the story was a little bit longer, it's because this is, after all, decades building this
Decade,
relationship. So, to be fair, you just condensed decades into whatever this amount of time was. So it is what it is, but
yes.
it's an amazing
Okay.
journey.
Okay. Well, I do hate to go into such detail, but it explains, when people say, "I met Leonard twice, why wasn't I a friend?" It's a process. And I was very
Very long
fortunate.
process.
Yes, and I was fortunate to have some of the circumstances I did, and
Mm.
was very, very aggressive early on with obtaining things that he was interested in terms of his career, in terms of his, much later on when our paths crossed, I handed him a photo that the Boston Globe had sent me because there had been an article in the Boston Globe. I wrote the Boston Globe and said, "Can I have the picture from this article?" Sure. And it's stamped on the back, property of Boston Globe. And so I asked Leonard to sign it. Once again, he had seen the article, he hadn't seen the proof. He looked at it and he went, "How did you get this?" And he was never upset. He was fascinated by it. It wasn't like, "Oh my God," he wasn't angry about it. He was, and I went, I asked him for it. And he went, I mean, it was, "Good for you," he applauded my ingenuity sometimes. And of course he, you know, signed it, and so um, I just think it was a combination that I earned his trust, and he saw me in situations other than, or in addition to a Star Trek based,
Yeah.
scenario.
It sounds very much like that's what it was, that you were able to kind of respect him as an artist beyond just that one thing he did. That was really, in a very, very important part of his life, but also a footnote compared to everything else that he has done and wanted to do.
Mhm,
And I think that kind of brings me to the next point I want to talk about, which you mentioned was his photography. So,
mhm.
a lot of folks might not know the different artistic skills that Leonard had. Can you talk about a little bit about his photography, what kind of things he liked to photograph,
Mhm.
and what kind of a photographer was he?
Okay. His interest in photography went all the way back to his childhood. I mean, he has mentioned this in some of his books where he had a camera, and of course, this is when he was still living with his parents and grandparents in Boston, and he would develop things in the family bathroom. He'd go buy the chemicals. He'd go, just take more pedestrian photos, of things, and he loved the experience of being in the dark room. And of course, he said we only had one bathroom, so I learned how to develop things. you know, I heard a lot of banging on the door while I was doing this, but this was, something from childhood that fascinated him. Now, what his initial later on, he would say it was the idea of creating something that had not been created before. So think about that. When you take a photo, it's your perspective, it's your vision. No one else is going to take something exactly like the photo you took. So again, it was his buying into the creative process in another way. And I think that was the initial hook. He actually studied photography at UCLA in the 70s. I mean, in coursework and intensive study. He didn't come by it casually. So he was a serious student for a long time. He kept a lot of the photos, sometimes it was, scenery. He would take photographs on location. He took a lot of photos in Spain when he was doing a movie called Catlow. He took, more artistic photos of family members, and people may not have known they were family members. And it was when his first wife Sandy came home one day with a book that combined poetry and photographs. And she said, "You like writing poetry, you've taken these photos, maybe you can do what this guy did and put them together." And so the first exposure to the public was in the 70s. I think You and I, the poetry book, probably came out in 75 or so, which combined his poetry and photographs. So that's when the public learned, that he did both, that he could do one or the other and both and combine. And it was a relatively best seller for a poetry book. I think it sold 350,000 copies for a poetry book in the 70s. That was pretty good. Um, so he continued, the photography is always with him. Then he transitioned from taking photographs of where I've been and pretty things and whatnot, to wanting to become more thematic. I wanna have a concept. I wanna do more artistic, conceptual, photography, and that's what he later leaned into. And, his first major project was, Shekinah, which he was fascinated with the feminine presence of God as it is in the Jewish tradition. And so he did a book of images that he purposefully was trying to capture on film, a representation of the feminine aspect of God. And so that was the theme. So he became more thematic. So the photos would be leaning towards that. Another one of his, thematic kind of photography projects was the Full Body Project. He felt like women were under way too much pressure to maintain a certain body weight, and that image, for one reason, seemed to be very sexist. Men could be tolerated for more things than women could be, age, weight, you know,
Yeah.
um, um, and he thought that was unfair, and that, any type of body should be appreciated. So this was a collection of photographs of women who were heavy, and putting them in an artistic, settings, and celebrating their, what woman isn't going to love Leonard Nimoy now if you never loved him before? If you've got a guy who says you're fine just the way you are, and let's celebrate that. And he was also leaning into being more interested in aspects of the female figure, period. Some number of the Shekinah photographs have women clothed, some unclothed. Same with Full Body Project. It was nothing lewd or anything about it. He just thought the feminine presence was to be celebrated. What you bring to the table. And he said in an interview with the radio station that I had on file at one time, that even his best friends tended to be women. They didn't, he had male friends, and he said, I really can't explain that, other than, my mother was a very strong woman, by this time he was married to his second wife. My wife Susan's a very strong woman. I just like women, and so, um, um, you know, uh, and then there was the project that I sponsored, was primary. There were other sponsors, but I was the primary, was Secret Sales. And this was fully closed. Well, some were not, but that wasn't the focus. This was totally regarding come to see me. He was at Rich Michelson's, his gallerist's um, studio in Northampton, Massachusetts. Come as the person you really are, or come as the person you wish you were, or the person that you keep hidden. Your secret self, however you want to translate that. Come as that person. And boy, he had a wide variety of people to come in. Some people came in as rock stars, some people came in as strippers, some people came in as, there was a rabbi that came in had been hidden, had been hiding the fact he was gay from people, and so he posed with to try to convey that message. Another person came in and said they'd always wanted to be a mad scientist, and his hair was up, and he had all these devices with him. And another person came in, and he shot them as their secret self, and made a book out of that, and interviewed them, and included the DVD as part of the book of his interviews with these people. One person came in like in a dragon costume, like a jacket with the hood, with the dorsal, um, fins, and she had grown up the child of a preacher and never could play. He was a traveling preacher, and she always had to be on her best behavior. And she said, my secret self was the kid that wanted to get in this monster outfit. So he captured people just really being somewhat vulnerable, being somewhat truly honest about themselves that they hadn't been before. And I don't think if Leonard didn't have the personality he had, he wouldn't have gotten the stories out of these people that he did. And so this is how, and this was his first color photography exhibition or book. The others had all been in black and white. So there was always, and then he went from, darkroom photography to digital. So he made all these transitions as the world did, so his photography was constantly evolving, from as I say, the darkroom to the computer, from black and white to color, to what's going on around me, to things that were very conceptual and very thematic. So there was that progression. On a sad note, he later implied, of course, he was a voracious smoker for a number of years, 2 packs a day, for like 30 years. But he thought also, and I don't remember what interview this was, that the hours and hours he spent in the darkroom with the chemicals, he was inhaling all of that stuff all of that time too. And he would spend hours in a dark room. He thought that was his escape. That was his, He loved the process of creating, but he just liked the solitariness of it, and that he could just be with it. But he thought back later, I did that so many years. Those chemicals probably were not,
Hmm.
real helpful in that process too.
Hey everybody, we'll get right back to the interview in 1 second, but I wanted to remind you all to check out Trek Untold over at Patreon. Patreon is the best way to directly support creators of things you like through a monthly subscription of an amount that you can choose. Trek Untold has a few different tiers already with different benefits, ranging from early access to episodes, the ability to ask a future guest questions, exclusive merchandise, and other bonuses that I'd love to offer, but first I need to grow that Patreon community to do that. Trek Untold has been around since mid-2020 and has grown a ton since then, thanks to listeners and viewers like you. Through a platform like Patreon, you can help me keep improving the quality of each episode and keep bringing you new interviews with folks that make the Star Trek universe what it is. If this community can grow more over on Patreon, I can offer new perks like watch parties, exclusive Trek Untold episodes, being able to directly interact with guests, and other things, but in order to do that, I need to know my audience wants these things. The best way to tell me what you want is by supporting us on Patreon, so please check us out at patreon.com/trekuntold today and become a bigger part of the Trek Untold family. And now, back to the interview. Yeah, I knew a little bit about Leonard's photography, but one thing I didn't really know as much about was his poetry. That's like pretty much all new territory to me, and more so, I didn't even know that he did a combination of those two things together at some point. But I'd love to hear now a little bit about Leonard Nimoy, the poet. Do you happen to have any of his books nearby?
I think I do. His first books came out in the 70s, and I would think at like 75 to maybe mid 80s, was the progression. And then there have been some compilations that have been published. I think the last one was in 2002. You can still find some of them on eBay. You can find them. This is one of the compilations, and he could be very. This was called Warm Up. This was a compilation and probably came out in 2002. This is just poetry, not all of his books were poetry and photography. This one is primarily poetry, but he could be very amused with his poetry. I'm just going to read two to you. And then he could be very serious. So he was very whimsical, could be very whimsical and also a lot of it was very autobiographical too. Rocket ships are exciting, but so are roses on a birthday. Computers are exciting, but so is a sunset. And logic will never replace love. Sometimes I wonder where I belong, in the future or in the past. I guess I'm just an old-fashioned spaceman. So, he's acknowledging kind of there's me and then there's Spock and I'm still working with that. This one is a little longer, but it's so autobiographical. He is speaking about his struggle to be an actor. He's speaking about his children being born. He's speaking about, I think, losing, not getting all the accolades he may have liked, like an Emmy. I think he's referring to having to the process of being an actor and what that's like. So um, because this is so reflects so much of him is the reason I chose it. I have walked alone seeking answers. I have lived alone chasing dreams. I have tried to prove my worth to worthless judges. I have cried my pain in silent screams. I have been sometimes served a touch of kindness. I have wandered in golden fields of grace. I have been released by honest laughter. I have touched the western wall of the holy place. I have soared alone above the cloud heads. I have walked the deep dark tunnels of the earth. I have dined with mystics and with prophets. I have heard the pain of woman giving birth. I have been sought after as a teacher. I have been refused the laurel wreath. I have heard the thunder blast of sunrise. I have watched the final touch of death. I have played the rules set by the master, though often I didn't understand the game. I have worn more masks than I can remember. I've been a face without a name. And when you ask, like you, I ask the final question, who on earth am I supposed to be? I always come full circle to the answer, me. Only me, always me.
So you think that laurel wreath was probably an Emmy award?
I think the laurel
Yeah.
wreath, he did hear his first wife give birth. He had to be in the next room. This was in the 50s. Dads weren't in the delivery room, but he remembers hearing his wife, giving birth. He was a pilot. He, has soared above the clouds.
Hmm.
He's worn more masks than he can remember. A face without a name, the people that would come up and go, I know you from somewhere, but I don't, he captures a lot of of stuff about sorting it all out. Well, if you indulge me, there is one last one, and because this is pertinent to um, the latter part of his life.
Sure.
Um, I have a garden that I love. And he was a gardener. He did enjoy getting his hands dirty in the dirt. Once in a while, it looks perfect. All the watering, feeding, pruning, and love add up to a moment of beauty. Then I think if only I could keep it this way, preserve this moment forever. But my garden is alive. Time and seasons bring changes. Living things must change. A life is like a garden. Perfect moments can be had, but not preserved, except in memory. I am a living thing that must change. If I can accept the changes, I can accept myself. And when I accept myself, I can enjoy the changes and the beauty of the changes in the garden of my life. Now, the reason I chose this, his last tweet was, a life is like a garden, perfect moments can be had, but not preserved except in memory. This poem that 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 he had written years ago, he went back to and chose that for his final tweet.
So he really used a lot of his poetry to work through a lot of his internal struggles, whether it be with acting or just who he is as a person, who he is now, where he's come from, where he's going.
I
That's
think so, Matthew. I think you're
yeah,
right. He could process it through that. hmm and thank you for people either do not realize or have forgotten that he was a poet, he was a photographer, he was a director, he was a writer, he was a producer, he was a philanthropist. Renaissance man that term gets thrown around a lot, but in his case, is actually true. I think.
Based on your experiences with Leonard, I mean, do you think, and I don't know if he ever voiced this to you, but do you think that he was ever concerned that like people might be listening to his poems or looking at his photos more because they want to just support him because he's this guy from the Star Trek world? Or, was he worried that they weren't really looking at him and appreciating his actual art skills and what he was trying to say with his work?
I think he was putting it out there and then just letting the chips fall where they may. Some people will be drawn to it because they're interested in poetry. Other people may be drawn to it because Leonard Nimoy is on the cover. Other people may be drawn to it that don't even know who Leonard Nimoy is, but liked the photo or liked the poem. So I think he realized there would be various motivations for buying or participating in his work, and he was like, I'm putting it out there, and I think I'm paraphrasing something he's actually said, let the chips fall as they may. In terms of his photography, interestingly enough, someone, and I don't know whether it was Susan or a friend of Leonard's or what, submitted his photography to Rich Michelson, who became his gallerist, without attaching his name,
Hmm.
and asked, "What's your opinion on these things?" On these photos, because Rich, his gallery, takes photography, takes other artwork. It specializes, ironically, in children's book illustrations. But Rich is a fascinating individual, and he and Leonard were very close. They emailed every day for the last, I don't know how many years of his life. Um, and Rich said, told whoever submitted them, this is good. No, this is good. This is worthy. This is who is this guy? Yeah, I might be interested. And then he was knew of Leonard Nimoy, but wasn't into Leonard Nimoy, and so he was on the photography, at least on the gallery level, respected for the work before they knew whose it was. And there are several museums across the country that have a Leonard Nimoy print. And museums don't take prints in their accept prints for their museum because a celebrity is attached to it. They have to see the artistic merit. They have a museum in Los Angeles County Museum, the New Orleans Museum of Art. These are legit museums that have a Leonard Nimoy in their collection.
So I think a lot of us, might not know or have known about the photography and the poetry, but I think many of us do know about Leonard's stint as a singer. And particularly, I want to ask you, you already know where I'm going with this. I want to ask you about the Ballad of Bilbo Baggins. That's like a viral internet thing. I'm
Woo!
curious if you ever talked to him about the Ballad of Bilbo or just, what was up with his singing career?
Right. We did not. He would if when anyone would we did not, to answer your question directly, but he always, chuckled. I think he thought the two areas in which he was least um comfortable, I don't want to say comfortable, at least adept in. He said he was a poor draftsman. When he tried to draw, it was terrible. I mean, he had trouble even with his name in cement. When he did it down at Disney World. I mean, he was like trying to figure out spatial things. His name ended up. He realized he was a poor draft, as he called it, a poor draftsman. He used that as opposed to artist. He knew his limitations as a singer. He wasn't immune to that. He said in the 60s, though, everyone put out an album that was on television. I mean, think about it. I mean, Jack Webb even put out an album from Dragnet. Lorne Green put out an album. I mean, and Dot Records came to him, and said, would like to play. So it was kind of something that you did back then. William Shatner put out an album, and boy, I don't even want to open the can of worms as to who is the better singer, because people have very strong opinions about that. But I think it was something that he once again he felt this is another outlet. This is something I haven't done before. Let's play with it and let the chips fall where they may. I mean, and so and he was even recording albums into his Mission Impossible days. I mean, I think there are like 5 or 6 albums in all, and maybe only 2 came out during the Star Trek things, so he continued it. No, he didn't talk. He grew more comfortable singing it in the later years. People would request it at conventions, and he'd do a chorus or 2 of it. He would never sing the entire song. He probably couldn't remember the entire song, but he would do the Bilbo, and in fact, he did it at that convention in Boston. It was asked of him, and he said, and then he went, "That's enough," So he'd do it, and of course, he did it very famously in the commercial that he did with Zach Quinto.
Mm,
He's singing it in the car. So he saw it go from this is something I want to try to maybe this has become a pop culture um, joke to this is a fond memory to this is fun to give the people what they want. I think it was all of the above.
mm.
You know, but he knew he couldn't hang his hat on singing, but I think he enjoyed once again the creative process of putting out these albums. I think he likened his style as to like being more like Johnny Cash, as opposed to, an opera singer or anything like that. I did not see him in any of these productions, but he must have felt comfortable enough singing because he did musicals. He did My Fair Lady. He did The King and I. He did musical productions. So he after Star Trek, so he probably said, "Hey, what the hell, I'll do my best, and I probably won't get rave notices for my singing. But if you got him in the right key and in the right circumstances, he wasn't terrible.
Yeah.
He didn't have a wide range because of that low voice. He had a beautiful voice. I mean, it lent himself. He did so many narrations, of documentaries and things. His voice was, you know, gorgeous. But singing, no, I think he would. I think now, if but the latter years of his life, he embraced it in that commercial. He sung it more, and he was more comfortable with it. He was like, you know, um, it's a piece of history, good or bad. Let's just embrace it and not be embarrassed and not be. I think he was okay with it. I think there may have been a time he was like, but it was a process with him, with as is everything else.
And to answer the question of who was the better singer between William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, the answer is Nichelle Nichols. Nichelle Nichols is the better singer. Thank you.
True, true. No, that is definitely the correct answer. Definitely the correct answer. And of the '60s people, it was probably Ed Ames who actually was a
Yeah.
singer. He played Mingo, on Daniel Boone. But he was a member of the Ames brothers. Google it, people. They were chart toppers back in the '50s. But yes, Nichelle definitely has them all beat.
So, I want to see if we can actually get some insight on something else that is more or less related to Star Trek, and that would be the relationship between Leonard Nimoy and William Shatner. I don't know if he's ever said anything to you in confidence that you are able to talk about or whatever, but what did you hear from Leonard and his family about their relationship and why things
Mm,
went south and why they never really seemed to ever repair?
right, right. An interesting and sad, sad circumstance. Um, we never talked about his relationship at any length. Many of our conversations were, of course, about his family or about the project he was working on, be it a stage production or a photography exhibition. It was about his work or his family, that type of thing. During the time I was up in Massachusetts for the Secret Sales exhibition, again, we got to spend more time together. And I had brought some of my scrapbooks and some of my photo albums, and we were flipping through it. And imagine going through Leonard's career with Leonard, as we're turning the pages. And there were one or two things he held that he pulled out and held that by then I had the wherewithal to say, "Would you like that?" Yeah, and so he took several things, and of course I'm going, "Ooh," but then again, there's stuff he wanted, and of course I wanted him to have it. I truly did. So anyway, in the midst of going through these things, I would have a few Star Trek things in there. I had a separate album of Star Trek. Then I had other albums of his theater work, his TV work, and his movie work. So he was be flipping. He'd go, "Well, there's Billy. Well, that's when Billy and I were doing that. Well, that's when we were the Jewish Nazis," and he'd make comments like that. And we're all and usually said Billy, which I thought I didn't know whether that was a term of endearment or he's tweaking him a little bit
Hmm,
or he's publicly it was usually Bill. Bill and I were at this convention, but it was Billy. Yeah, there's Billy. And so, I wasn't quite sure. It wasn't said in a mean way, but it was also kind of, I don't know, I just thought it was interesting. I didn't hear him refer to Billy publicly
hmm,
very much. Perhaps he did, and I'm wrong, but privately, it was usually Billy. So,
interesting.
I'm not quite sure what that was about. Um, I think, as most people know, they had their ups and downs through the years. I mean, and we didn't talk. Again, our conversation set was not usually about Star Trek, but they did have their very public ups and downs, and their personalities are very different. They had a lot of things in common, but in many ways, were quite different too. And in terms of what was the last straw, I don't think there maybe was one thing. I think it was probably accumulative. And of course, as Leonard grew sicker, and he was sicker for a longer time than people realized that he had been. I mean, his decline was longer than what was publicly known in terms of his difficulty breathing, in terms of his stays in the multiple stays in the hospital. He did have hospice care for that for those final days, but the decline, and I think that was might have been part of it. You know, when you're sick, when you know you're probably terminal, you 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 focus on your family, and you focus on getting things done, and you focus on your and in his case, just breathing. He was exhausted from just trying to breathe, even with oxygen and everything. So I think part of it was him just letting go of a lot of external stuff in his life. He became more insular. And I think that relationship was part of the things he thought he could part with, while he was trying to do all of this. Again, first and foremost, there was not, I don't know of any one reason. I'm piecing it together too, but I know he limited a number of his contacts with friends, because he had to. He didn't have the energy for it, and he wasn't well. And when you don't feel well, you really don't feel like entertaining people, or having company, when you're that sick. Um, I did have very gracious of her. I had lunch with Susan Nimoy back in 2019, pre-COVID. I was out in California, and she very graciously said, I'd, love to have lunch with you. And we went to Factor's Deli on Pico Boulevard, which was Leonard's favorite delicatessen. And she pointed out the things on the menu that he liked, and it was all the high salt things, the sardines and the gefilte fish and this and this and this and this. And I said, "How was his blood pressure?" She laughed and she said, "His blood pressure was great. He would eat all of these things, and she said his blood pressure was great, his mind was great. He had no lungs. He just had no lungs, you know." So it was in the context of this conversation we were, you know, talking about those final weeks or months, and I don't know how Bill's name came up, but it did, and she said, "Well, what is he doing now?" And that told me that there had not been any contact. You're asking me what William Shatner's doing. So obviously the two of you have not stayed in touch since Leonard's passing. And I said, well, he's still on the conventions, circuit, and he's still very active and still filming things and still involved in a lot of projects and still traveling. And she went, really? And I said, "Yeah, yeah, he's still," and she went, "Wow." And I realized at that point that was my golden opportunity, and I missed it, to say, "What happened there?" And I think she would have told me, because she had been very generous in some of the other things she had shared with me. And I, just didn't take the beat, or you look back on conversations with people and go, "Why didn't I?" And I think she would have shared that. But I think the fact that she had not stayed in touch and did not really know what he was doing, and I don't know whether that was by Leonard's request or just Susan feeling there's no reason. You remember Susan wasn't there until in the Star Trek, wasn't there for the Star Trek series. She wasn't there until the last two movies, and then the Kelvin timeline was. So she didn't have the history with Shatner that, that Leonard did. It remains a mystery. I do think Susan is very forthright. I mean, very honest, very forthright, very tells it like it is kind of person. I do think if William Shatner picked up the phone and said what happened, she would tell him. But William Shatner, to our knowledge, and that's not a slam, he has his prerogative to handle things how he wants to handle them. But his saying, "I really don't know what happened," when he says that, I want to say, pick up the phone and ask Susan, because she's not going to sugarcoat it, you know. So I think either he really knows what happened or he doesn't want to hear. And as I say, that's his prerogative to play it that way or to honestly not want to know.
So on this kind of area of Star Trek now, since we're in this part now, Star Trek is one of the first real fandoms, and it is one of the fandoms that has carried over for many, many decades. So I'm curious to know what Leonard thought about the fact that this little show he worked on for a few years grew into this massive, multi-generational spanning franchise. What did he think about the idea of Trekkies and just the fandom of Star Trek?
Right. I think as with all the cast, they were stunned, that this happened, from a show that ran 3 years and was not in the top 10, ratings-wise any of those years. And that they had to squeeze every nickel and dime, out of, in terms of its production. It wasn't, I think they were all stunned, and of course, everybody gives various reasons for its popularity and duration over these many years. I think Leonard has said that he thought it was over many times. He thought it was over after the series ended. Then he thought it was over after the first movie. He truly did, because it was not did not get the reception. It's more appreciated now than it was in 1979, for sure. You know, so he said that's the end of it. And then he thought when Spock died, and there's all kinds of stories about what, when, wherefore, whose idea was it, and then, he thought, well, maybe that'll be it. So I think he felt it was over multiple times. He said, "When I was doing Mission Impossible, I wasn't thinking about Star Trek. I mean, that's what I was more known for, but, you know, um, and then, of course, he went back to the theater, which was his roots and really his love, was actually, doing theater. I think he went through phases with it, which are well known. First, he was oblivious of it because they were living their lives and they were doing other projects while this groundswell was going on. And then, um, and then he felt it was keeping him from doing other types of things. And so there was that period of, I want to step back from it. I really, need to be known for other things. I want to do other things. I don't want to be a one note. I want to do this. And then there was the full circle coming around, that, I need to recognize that this is meaningful to people and therefore needs to be meaningful to me again. So I think there was this reproachment about it. Um, he did mention, and I think it was half in jest, but he preferred the term Trekker to Trekkie. I think he felt Trekker was, who's all about was a little more dignified, than Trekkie. But he certainly wasn't going to go on a tear about that or a campaign about that. And he's like, the press is going to do what they do. And I've always noticed when the press is covering conventions, they tend to go to the most bizarre looking person rather than the scientist, that is at the convention. I think that's gotten a little better, but during the 70s, my first convention was in the 70s, probably it was in Atlanta, and it was back when you paid one price and you got all the photographs and autographs and access to the stars
Yeah, I don't know what that's like, Bonnie.
you wanted. And none of them had bodyguards, and if you had spare seat at the table for breakfast at the hotel, thing. You sit down with them, and it was that type of thing. I feel like I need to get that shirt. I may be old, but I was at all the cool conventions. you know, like that one that says, I may be old, but I heard all the good bands. That it needs to be a T-shirt like that. It's a whole different time, but I think Leonard was again first oblivious of it, then avoidant of it, and then embraced it.
So we've kind of touched on this a lot through some of the different questions and answers we've gotten here about Leonard today, but I'd love to know if you could talk to us a little bit more, really about those final days of Leonard Nimoy's life. Like, I don't know if you remember your last conversation with him and just, where he was at. And I guess to
Hmm.
take it one step further, had he ever talked to you about how he wanted to be remembered?
Oh goodness, wow. I knew through both Gary Hassan and Rich Michelson. Those were my two conduits to Leonard. Even though I had an email address, even though I had access to his personal secretary for many years, Katrine, who has since Susan retained Katrine after his passing for a while, but she now has someone else. But Katrine was a conduit to Leonard, as was Rich and Gary. And I say that to say I never called, I never emailed, I
You went through the
respected.
proper channels, kind of thing.
I went through the proper channels on everything, and for a while, I mailed things just to his, office. I mean, even before his passing, to Katrine at the office. It was finally Susan during one of the times we met, when she said, "Why do you keep sending things to the office? Send them to the house." So, I had once I had that invitation, I could mail things directly to the house, and I thought it amusing. I'm trying to be respectful, and you're saying, "Forget that, mail we wanna get the stuff at the house." So, I could mail things to the house, but I never emailed, I never called. So most of the information I got was either through Gary Hassan or Rich Michelson. I knew things were changing when he sold the house in Lake Tahoe, which he loved. Um, but you gotta remember the altitude that Lake Tahoe is at. He literally couldn't breathe comfortably up there. So when I heard the house had sold, I was like, "Hmm." And then after Christmas or the holidays, he and Susan usually went on a trip, on a beach trip, St. Bart's or Cabo San Lucas or something. They go no trip, after Christmas. And so I'm piecing, kind of all of this together. He had to cancel some appearances. And there was a revival of Vincent in New York that he had committed to, not to do, but to be there to answer questions afterwards. Vincent meant a lot to him. Now, Leonard did tell me Vincent was a blessing in his life, quote unquote. He canceled that.
Mm.
And I was like, okay, this is all December, January, and of course the pictures of him in the wheelchair with the oxygen in the airport that made the Enquirer and everything were even a few months before that, you know. So I knew this time is serious. Um, the last, well, there are two lasts. I sent Gary Hassan emailed me on February 2nd. Leonard died on the 27th of February, I think. I could have that wrong. Emailed me on February 2nd and said, saw Leonard yesterday. As always, I gave him your best wishes and so forth. Um, I don't even see Leonard much anymore because of his desire to, and he was paraphrasing, because of his desire to, you know, um, um, to be at home more often. I don't know how he paraphrased it. He didn't say because of his being sick. But that was February 2nd, so the same month. But I was grateful Gary had told him hello and Bonnie's, said Goober says hey, Bonnie said hey, and he acknowledged that. Then Rich Michelson had given to Leonard some things that I had given to Rich, and this is another long story. Um, that Leonard had kind of wanted. Playwright Clifford Odets, I presume it's pronounced like that, or Odets, who wrote one of the early plays Leonard was in, and I had some materials on him. So again, I think this was in February. Rich said gave Leonard the materials, or maybe it was in January, February. I know Gary was in February. Rich may have been in January. And he said, I gave Leonard the materials that you gave him. He was thrilled to see them, and we went over them together, about the playwright, Clifford Odette. So those were the last two things. And then Rich had told me he was in the hospital, and Rich had just written a book called Fascinating about Leonard, a children's book. He was a children's book author in addition to being a gallerist, which is multidimensional, just like Leonard was, which is why they were so tight. And Rich said, you know, I told Leonard he was going to have to go on tour with me to promote the book. And then there was something like, and again, I'm paraphrasing, but that may or may not happen, something like to that, extent. And again, I'm paraphrasing, excuse me, Rich and Gary, if I'm, being inaccurate. So I knew with all these signs with Tahoe and with this, and canceling things that I knew were very important to Leonard, that Vincent thing, that this and that. So my last communications were really through Rich and Gary. Um, Probably some months before, I had ordered a photograph, and Rich had told Leonard that I had ordered a photograph to add to my collection. And Rich forwarded the email from Leonard, and it said, I'll get on it. Or I think he needed to sign it or number it or something. He says, I'll get right on that. And then he went, and please thank dear Bonnie. And I think that was very, very, very touching for me. And I appreciated Rich forwarding that. He said, you need to hear it from him, not from me. So, it was still a shock. It wasn't totally, I was perhaps slightly more prepared than some people who didn't have some of the backstories, but it was still a shock. I was working for hospice at that time. These were, and I talked to one of the oncologists with and he knew I was a big fan of Leonard's, had him on my desk, had photographs and whatnot. And so he asked me, he said, is your friend still in the hospital? And I said, yes, he's been in there a bit, but they're discharging him, and it seems like right away. And he crossed his arms and went, Bonnie, when you have a hospitalization like that and you're discharged right away, you're probably going home and I went, yep, 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 yep. And indeed, that was exactly what had happened. Leonard had preferred to pass at home with his family with him. He was able to tell everyone, he was able to have the conversation with everyone as to his being proud of them, what they meant to him. I mean, what a blessing to be able to do that. And Julie's husband later told me, I said, I read somewhere, and this might be hearsay, and you don't have to answer, that he actually passed and had a smile on his face. And her husband said, that's true. That is true. And I said, wow, that's, if this has to happen, could it have happened under any better circumstances?
I mean, considering not just the effect he had in your life, but also just the fact that you had this amazing relationship with him too, it sucks seeing your hero die. That's kind of there's really no
Mhm.
other polite way to put it. But, and I don't think you really had a chance to have a final peace with him. But, if there's anything you wanted to tell him, what would you have said to Leonard if you could have your ideal last conversation with him?
Wow. I think I would have said thank you. I would have just said thank you for the talent that you had and have, and for the time you spent with us, and for making it quality time, and for caring as much about us as we did you. Thank you. Thank you.
But it's still wild to think that here we are, we're doing this interview in 2024, and Leonard Nimoy as Spock, he is still the iconic Spock, but more so, he's still the character he portrayed, inspiring people. Years
Right.
after his passing, years after the show has been on the air, that's kind of an amazing legacy to have. I mean, what do you think about the power of essentially Leonard Nimoy and the power of Spock? Because they are one and the same.
Yes, yes. And I think everyone wants to leave some kind of legacy. They hate to feel like their time on this earth, don't want to feel like their time on this earth was in vain or um, un, or unimpactful to people. So I think we all hold that to some degree. I think he would continue to be warmed by it. I think if anything, he would say, use Spock and whatever small part of this that I did as an example for tolerance, as an example for diversity, as an example for, finding a common path. I really think that's where he would be with it. I'm warmed by your response to Spock, and to me, you use whatever legacy we both have productively. You know, um, like Kirk said, his soul was he was the most human. You know, I think he would say, be the best human you could be.
Well, we spent the last 2 hours talking about Leonard Nimoy and his impact on you and his impact on others. But, we haven't really spent a ton of time talking about Bonnie Moss today. And I do want to make sure we get in one question before we wrap things up here. And that's for you, Bonnie. What do you want the legacy of Bonnie Moss to be?
Oh, good. I did a take. I didn't realize it had been 2 hours. I am so sorry. Um, and that's still this much of,
Oh, I'm
you know,
sure.
gosh. Well, I like to think my almost 40 years in social work, had an impact on patients and clients and families. Um, that my friend, that I was a good friend, that I was a good therapist. Were all flawed. Um, um, and that she had a hell of a Leonard Nimoy collection.
Well, there's no arguing that point.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so yeah, that's it. My great grandmother lived to be 107, and people were always asking her, "How did you get to live so, what's your secret? What did you do?" And she said, "I never tried to do anyone harm." There you go. Try to go through life without trying to do anyone harm.
Well, that's a very good quote. I think it's a good way to end this interview here. And it's really appropriate too, because, it's not every day that a fan of a TV show can become a friend of someone from that show, someone from that world. And you did it. And clearly Leonard saw something in you that said you were going to do no harm and he could trust you. So, it's been wonderful hearing these stories. Thank you for sharing them. Thank you for collecting all of this information, all of this history about Leonard to share with us and share with future Star Trek fans so that they know who the man was beyond just the Vulcan years.
Well, thank you for your interest, Matthew, and I hope that there's some, that the interest is out there as well. I know um, that there's general interest in Leonard Nimoy. I hope I fleshed some of that out. I love talking about him. Obviously, I do go to meetings of certain science fiction groups and have gone to a few conventions. I don't take any payment for doing that. If anyone wants to help with a meal or a room or transport to from the airport, more power to them. But I'm more than happy to talk anywhere, anytime, because he had that impact on me and had such an impact on so many other people.
Yeah, I highly recommend. I'm sure anybody who's listened to this interview now, they know. I highly recommend you get our friend over here into your convention because you're going to want to have Bonnie there. She's got so many great stories, and you're wonderful to chat with. I love hearing your Southern accent, by the way. Or sorry, I love hearing your voice. There's no Southern accent. It's you. Sorry,
Well, no, people, the accent is
I have
there.
the accent, not you.
Yeah, well, at Trek Long Island, I and Edwin Thrower, a good friend, we interviewed Oded Fair, yes, um, and we interviewed him, and I think Edwin asked him he was British, so he was being faced with this British accent and this Southern accent, and Edwin asked him, "Which one of are you getting confused with which one of our accents could you do?" And he turned to Edwin and said, "I can do you, but I can't do you." Meaning the British was gonna be easier for him than the Southern. So that was a funny moment, but I appreciate that. Again, Matthew, appreciate your interest. I'm sorry, I feel like I've gone on way too long, but, edit away, as is needed. I appreciate, anyone listening. Wanna give a shout out to my friends Edwin, to my friend Marty, to my friends Kavita, the artist, to Natalie, who has a wonderful Leonard Nimoy Facebook page, and then 10 other people are going to call me and say, why didn't you mention me? But anyway, there you go. Thank you, Matthew, anytime.
That's it for this week's episode of Trek Untold. Thank you for checking it out. Don't forget to follow us on social media, whether it's on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok at Trek Untold, and subscribe wherever you are listening to or watching on. And that includes the audio versions on whatever platforms that might be, and our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@TrekUntold. If you'd like to support this show financially, please consider visiting patreon.com/TrekUntold to become a member of this show. And along with getting access to all sorts of wonderful perks, you'll also know that you're helping out this show continue to thrive, survive, and make new content all the time. I'm Matthew Kaplowitz. This has been Trek Untold. Thanks for watching. And until next time, always remember, fortune favors the bold.
Trek Untold, the Star Trek podcast that goes beyond the stars, is powered by the Rageworks Podcast Network and affiliated with Nerd News Today.